Quick note before we start. Channel memberships are now live with early access, exclusive uploads, and members-only content for those who want to go deeper. Now, let's get into tonight's story. It walked upright through a clearing 200 yards out, casual as a hiker, except hikers don't stand 7.5 feet tall with arms that hang to their knees. This happened in November of 2022 in the Olympic National Forest on the western side of Washington State. My name doesn't matter for this, but what does matter is that I'm not the kind of person who panics easily or jumps to supernatural explanations. I spent 6 years in the Marine Corps, including 2 deployments where staying calm under pressure was the difference between coming home and not. I've done winter survival training. I know how to read terrain, how to navigate without technology, and how to assess threats rationally. My hiking partner for this trip was a guy I'd known since college named Jake. Jake was a software engineer, the kind of meticulous person who keeps spreadsheets for his gear weight and calculates calorie requirements down to the decimal. He wasn't military, but he was competent and experienced. We'd done a dozen backcountry trips together over the years, and I trusted him to keep his head in difficult situations. We'd planned a 3-day traverse across a remote section of the Olympic Peninsula, entering from the Queets River trailhead and exiting near Graves Creek. The route would take us through old-growth forest, across several ridge lines, and into territory that doesn't see much traffic even during peak season. November's the off-season in the Olympics. The weather can be brutal, cold and wet, with storms rolling in from the Pacific without warning. But that's exactly why we liked it. No crowds, no noise, just forest and weather. We filed our itinerary with the ranger station on Thursday, November 10th, 2022. The ranger on duty was a younger guy, maybe late 20s, who looked at our route and asked if we'd done this traverse before. First time this specific route, Jake said, but we've both done plenty of Olympic backcountry. The ranger nodded and pulled out a map. He traced our route with his finger, then stopped at a section where we'd planned to drop down into a valley system. "You're planning to camp here?" he asked, tapping the valley. "That's the idea," I said. "Looks like there's water, and it's a good halfway point." He was quiet for a moment, like he was choosing his words carefully. "If I were you, I'd stay on the ridges. Camp high. The valley bottoms get cold this time of year, and the drainage can be tricky if it rains." "We've got good gear," Jake said. "We'll be fine." The ranger looked at him, then at me. "I'm sure you do, but seriously, use the ridges. Better visibility, better drainage, better everything." There was something in the way he said it that made me pay attention. Not fear exactly, but a kind of firm insistence that went beyond normal weather concerns. I pulled out my map and marked 2 alternate camping spots on higher ground. "Ridges it is," I said. He looked relieved. "Good. Also, you guys carrying bear spray?" "Always," Jake said. "Good, and if you hear anything weird at night, wood knocking, that kind of thing, just stay in your tents. It's probably nothing, but there's no point investigating in the dark." Jake and I exchanged a glance. "Wood knocking?" I asked. The ranger shrugged, but his expression was neutral, in a way that felt practiced. Branches falling, wind, trees rubbing together. It can sound weird out there, especially if you're not used to it. We thanked him and left. As we walked to the truck, Jake said, "That was a little strange, right? The way he kept pushing the ridge camping." "Yeah," I said, "but he's the local expert. No reason not to take his advice." We started hiking around 7 in the morning on Friday, November 11th, 2022. The weather was overcast but dry, with temperatures in the low 40s. The trail followed the Queets River for the first few miles, and the sound of rushing water was constant and loud. The forest here is temperate rainforest, and it's overwhelming in its scale. Sitka spruce and western red cedar, rising hundreds of feet, trunks wider than trucks, moss hanging from every branch like green curtains. The understory is dense with ferns and salal, and the ground is a sponge of decomposing organic matter that muffles your footsteps. We made good time and stopped for lunch around noon at a spot where a massive fallen cedar created a natural bench. The tree had been down for years, maybe decades, and was covered in moss and small saplings growing out of it. We ate quickly because the temperature was dropping, and sitting still made you cold fast. As we packed up, Jake pointed to something across a small clearing. You see that? I looked where he was pointing. There was a structure made of branches, 3 saplings bent over and twisted together at the top, forming a teepee shape about 6 feet tall. The saplings were still green, the breakpoints fresh enough that you could see lighter wood underneath the bark. Probably kids, I said, or a trail crew marker. Out here, Jake said, we're 8 miles from the nearest road. He had a point. We walked over to examine it. The saplings had been bent with significant force, the kind of strength that would take a grown man straining hard to achieve. And they'd been woven together at the top in a way that wasn't random. There was intention to it. Weird, Jake said, but not impossible. Someone had time on their hands. We moved on, but I kept thinking about it. The ranger's comment about staying on ridges, the fresh breaks in green wood, the isolated location. My training had taught me to notice patterns, and there was a pattern here even if I couldn't articulate what it meant yet. We climbed out of the river valley in the afternoon, gaining elevation steadily until we reached a ridgeline that ran roughly east to west. The plan was to follow this ridge for several miles before finding a campsite. The views were limited by fog that had rolled in, but the ridge itself was clear of dense undergrowth, making walking easier. Around 4 in the afternoon, we found a good spot to camp. A flat area protected by a rock outcrop on one side and with a decent view down both slopes. There was no water source immediately nearby, but we'd filled our bottles at the last creek and had enough for dinner and breakfast. We set up tents quickly as the light was fading fast. Jake had a small 1-person ultralight tent. I had a slightly larger 2-person model because I don't like feeling cramped. We cooked a hot dinner on my camp stove, ate watching the fog swirl through the trees below us, and talked about the next day's route. That's when we heard the first wood knock. It came from somewhere down in the valley to our north, a sharp, resonant crack that echoed slightly. Thwack. We both stopped talking and listened. Tree fell, Jake said. Maybe, I said. We waited. About 30 seconds later, another knock came from the south side, down the opposite slope. Thwack. Then a third knock from the east, farther away. Thwack, thwack. That's not trees falling, Jake said quietly. I agreed. Trees falling don't happen in patterns, and they don't sound like that. This was wood on wood, deliberate impacts, and they were spaced out in a way that felt communicative. We sat there listening for another 10 minutes. The knocking continued sporadically, sometimes close, sometimes distant, always that same sharp crack. Eventually it stopped, and the normal forest sounds resumed. The patter of light rain on leaves, the distant call of a raven. Let's get some sleep, I said. Early start tomorrow. Jake nodded, but I could tell he was unsettled. We both heard stories, the kind of things people talk about when they've had too much to drink around a campfire, but we'd never given them much credence. This was different. This was happening to us, and neither of us had a rational explanation that felt satisfying. I slept poorly that first night, not because of fear exactly, but because my mind wouldn't settle. I kept listening for the wood knocks, for footsteps, for anything unusual. Around midnight, I heard something that made me fully alert. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, moving through the forest below our ridge. Not the light patter of deer, not the rustling of smaller animals. These were big steps, and they were bipedal. Step, step, pause. Step, step, pause. I lay in my sleeping bag, barely breathing, tracking the sound. Whatever was making it was moving parallel to our ridge, heading east at a steady pace. It continued for several minutes, then faded into the distance. In the morning, Jake looked as tired as I felt. Over instant coffee and oatmeal, he said, Did you hear something last night? Like footsteps? Yeah, I said. Around midnight. Something big moving east. He nodded slowly. I heard it too. I kept telling myself it was a elk, but the rhythm was wrong. We packed up camp and started hiking. The ridge continued for another 3 miles before we'd need to descend into a different valley system. The fog had lifted somewhat, giving us better visibility. The forest was beautiful in that stark November way, all grays and greens and browns with patches of frost in the shadows. Around mid-morning, we found tracks. We descended slightly off the ridgeline to navigate around a rocky section, and in a patch of soft mud near a seasonal stream there were prints. At first glance, they looked like large human footprints, but the scale was wrong. These were easily 15 or 16 inches long and proportionally wide. 5 toes, a clear arch, a deep heel strike. I crouched next to them and pulled out my phone for photos. Jake stood back, looking around nervously. What the hell makes a print like that? He asked. I don't know, I said. I'd seen plenty of bear tracks, and these weren't that. The toe arrangement was too human. The arch was too pronounced, and the depth suggested something incredibly heavy. There were 3 prints in a clear sequence, each one showing a normal walking stride. Whatever had made them had been moving uphill in the same direction we were heading. The prints were fresh, the edges still sharp, no degradation from rain or wind. We should turn back, Jake said. I looked at him. And go where? We're a day and a half from either trailhead. At this point, forward is the same distance as back. He knew I was right, but he didn't like it. Then we need to move fast. I don't want to be out here another night. We pushed hard the rest of the morning, making better time than we'd planned. The terrain cooperated, and by early afternoon we'd covered significant distance. But the feeling of being watched had intensified. It was like a pressure on the back of the neck, a constant awareness that we weren't alone. Around 2 in the afternoon, we stopped for a water break at the top of a small rise that gave us a view of a clearing about 200 yards downslope. The clearing was maybe 50 yards across, covered in low brush and dead grass. We were drinking from our bottles when Jake grabbed my arm and pointed. Do you see that? He whispered. I looked where he was pointing. At the far edge of the clearing, something was moving. At first, I thought it was a person, a hiker crossing the same terrain we were. But as I focused on it, the details resolved into something that made my mouth go dry. It was huge, easily 7.5 feet tall, maybe more, covered in dark reddish-brown hair that caught the light as it moved. It was walking upright, casual and unhurried, with a gait that looked almost human, except for the length of the stride. Its arms hung at its sides, swinging slightly, and they were too long. The proportions were wrong in a way that my brain struggled to process. We stood frozen, watching it cross the clearing. It didn't look in our direction. It just walked with purpose from one side to the other, then disappeared into the tree line on the far side. The whole sighting lasted maybe 15 seconds. Jake's breathing was fast and shallow. Tell me you saw that. I saw it, I said. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. What was it? I don't know. But we need to keep moving. We started hiking again, but faster now. Neither of us wanted to articulate what we'd seen because saying it out loud would make it real, and making it real meant accepting that our understanding of the world had a significant gap in it. For the next 2 hours, we hiked in near silence. The forest felt different now, oppressive and watchful. Every shadow looked like it could be hiding something. Every sound made us stop and listen. Around 4 in the afternoon, we reached the area where we'd planned to camp for the second night. It was another ridgeline spot, similar to the first, with good visibility and defensible positioning. But as we started to set up camp, Jake said something that changed our plans. It's following us. I stopped and looked at him. What do you mean? The thing from the clearing. I think it's been pacing us. I keep seeing movement in the trees, off to our left, always at the same distance, always matching our speed. I scanned the forest. I hadn't seen anything, but that didn't mean Jake was wrong. You sure? No, he admitted, but I keep getting glimpses, something big moving parallel to us, and a couple times I've heard branches breaking, like something heavy pushing through the undergrowth. We stood there in the fading light, trying to decide what to do. The smart tactical move was to camp high, maintain visibility, and wait for morning. But the psychological weight of knowing something might be out there watching us was enormous. We camp here, I said finally, but we do it smart. No fire. We eat cold food. We set up tents back to back so we can hear each other, and we take shifts staying awake. Jake agreed. We set up quickly and efficiently, 2 tents touching at the vestibules so we could communicate easily. We ate granola bars and jerky, drank water, and settled in for what we both knew would be a terrible night. I took the first watch, sitting in my tent vestibule with the door open, headlamp off, bear spray in my lap. The forest around us grew dark quickly, and with the darkness came that same oppressive quiet we'd experienced the night before. Around 8 at night, the wood knocking started again. This time, it was closer, coming from multiple directions. Thwack from the east, answering thwack from the west, then south, then north. It felt like we were being surrounded. You hearing this? Jake whispered from his tent. Yeah. Stay quiet. Don't respond. The knocking continued for maybe 20 minutes, then stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. It felt like the entire forest was holding its breath. Then I heard the footsteps. They came from downslope to our east, moving slowly and deliberately up toward our camp. Heavy steps, bipedal, getting closer. I could hear the crunch of needles and twigs, the occasional snap of a small branch. The steps would advance a few paces, then stop, then advance again. Whatever was making them was being cautious, testing our response. I didn't move. I didn't turn on my light. I just sat there in the darkness, hand on the bear spray, and waited. The steps circled our camp at a distance of maybe 30 yards. They made a complete circuit over the course of 10 minutes, always staying just out of sight in the darkness. Then they stopped directly upslope from us, and I heard something that made my blood run cold. Breathing. Deep, heavy breathing that I could hear clearly despite the distance. It sounded like a large mammal after exertion, but the pattern was too controlled, too measured. It breathed in, it breathed out, it paused, it breathed in again. It's right above us, Jake whispered, his voice tight with fear. I know. Don't move. Don't make noise. We sat there for what felt like hours, but was probably only 15 minutes. The breathing continued, steady and deliberate. Then it stopped, and the footsteps resumed, moving away from our camp back down into the valley. I waited until I couldn't hear anything anymore, then whispered to Jake, You okay? No, he said honestly, but I'm functional. What the hell was that? I don't know. But it had multiple chances to come into camp and it didn't. It's staying at a distance. That's supposed to make me feel better? It's a fact. Whatever it is, it's curious but cautious. That's good. That means we can predict its behavior to some extent. Jake was quiet for a moment. You think it's what we saw in the clearing? Probably. And if it wanted to hurt us, it could have by now. We need to finish the night, then get out at first light. The rest of the night passed in tense silence. We didn't hear the footsteps again, but we both stayed awake, too wired to sleep. When the sky finally started to lighten, I felt a wave of relief so strong it almost made me dizzy. We broke camp fast, barely speaking, just moving with purpose. The plan was to descend into the final valley system and follow it out to the Graves Creek trailhead about 10 miles away. If we pushed hard, we could make it by early afternoon. The descent was steep and treacherous, lots of loose rock and slippery moss, but we made good time. Around mid-morning, We crossed a small stream and stopped briefly to filter water. That's when Jake pointed out something that made my stomach tighten. On the far side of the stream, at the edge of the forest, there was a tree structure, bigger than the first one we'd seen, made of larger branches arranged in an X pattern between two trees. And hanging from the center of the X was what looked like a dead squirrel, gutted and arranged with its limbs spread. That's a marker, Jake said quietly, or a warning. Someone or something is making these. I didn't disagree. We moved past it quickly, not stopping to investigate. The last thing we needed was to provoke whatever had been following us. The final few miles to the trailhead were a blur of adrenaline and forced calm. We didn't talk. We just walked, checking over our shoulders constantly, listening for footsteps or wood knocks. The forest felt alive with presence, like we were being escorted out rather than leaving on our own terms. When we finally saw the trailhead parking area through the trees, I felt my legs almost give out with relief. My truck was there, exactly where we'd left it, looking like the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. We threw our packs in the bed and climbed in, locking the doors immediately. I started the engine and sat there for a moment, hands on the wheel, just breathing. "We made it," Jake said. He sounded surprised. "Yeah, we did." As I started to put the truck in gear, Jake grabbed my arm. "Look." I followed his gaze. At the tree line, maybe 50 yards from the parking area, something was standing in the shadows. I couldn't see it clearly, but I could see the shape. Tall, broad-shouldered, upright, watching us. I put the truck in reverse and backed out slowly. The figure didn't move. It just stood there. And as we pulled onto the forest road and started driving away, I looked in the rearview mirror one last time. It was still there, standing at the edge of the clearing, like a sentinel marking the boundary between its world and ours. We drove straight to the ranger station at Graves Creek. A different ranger was on duty, an older woman who listened to our report with a neutral expression. When we finished, she pulled out a form and started filling it in. "You're not the first to report this kind of activity this year," she said. "We've had 3 other incidents in the same general area. Large bipedal tracks, wood structures, vocalizations at night." "Why didn't anyone tell us?" Jake asked. She looked up. "Tell you what exactly?" "That some people have reported unusual experiences in the backcountry. We can't issue warnings based on unverified wildlife reports, but we can document patterns." "The ranger at Queets told us to stay on the ridges," I said. "He knew something." She nodded. "He's worked this area for 5 years. He knows to trust his gut, and his gut says that the valleys are where most incidents occur." "He's not wrong." She finished the report and gave us a copy. "For what it's worth, you did everything right. You stayed calm. You didn't provoke anything. You got out safely. That's the best outcome." Jake and I drove home in silence. We didn't debrief. We didn't process. We just sat with what we'd experienced, both of us knowing that talking about it wouldn't make it make sense. Having been back to the Olympics, Jake sold all his backpacking gear within a month and took up rock climbing at indoor gyms instead. We don't talk about what happened, but every so often, he'll send me a news article about hikers reporting strange encounters in the Pacific Northwest, and I know he's thinking about that clearing. That figure walking upright with arms too long and a stride too casual for something that shouldn't exist. I still hike. I still camp. But I have different rules now. If a ranger gives me advice without fully explaining why, I take it. If I find tree structures in remote areas, I don't investigate. And if something starts pacing me through the forest at a fixed distance, I don't stop moving until I reach civilization. This isn't a story to entertain you. It's a warning based on direct experience. There are things in the deep wilderness of the Pacific Northwest that don't fit our standard categories. They're intelligent, they're curious, and they seem to understand boundaries. But those boundaries are theirs to enforce, not ours to test. If a trail crew gives you a rule without explaining it, that's the explanation. They've seen enough to know what not to talk about. Listen to them. And if you're out there and you see something crossing a clearing that walks like a person but isn't, don't try to follow it. Don't try to document it. Just mark its position, turn around, and head back the way you came. Some discoveries aren't worth making. When you hear bipedal footsteps outside your tent that are too heavy to be human and too deliberate to be a bear, you have two choices. Convince yourself you're wrong or accept what's circling you. This happened in August of 2023 in the Gifford Pinchot National Forest in southern Washington state, about 15 miles northwest of Mount Adams. I'm a land surveyor by trade, and I've spent the last 12 years doing boundary work, baseline surveys, and GPS control point establishment for both private companies and federal agencies. The work requires precision, patience, and a lot of time alone in remote locations. I'm comfortable with isolation. I'm comfortable with the wilderness, or at least I was before this. The Forest Service had contracted our firm to establish a new baseline survey for a section of land they were considering for trail expansion. The area in question was remote, accessible only by logging roads that hadn't seen maintenance in years, and the terrain was a mix of dense old-growth forest, rocky outcrops, and steep drainages. Perfect for getting good line-of-sight measurements, terrible for creature comforts. My partner for this project was a woman named Sarah, who'd been with our firm for about 3 years. She was younger than me, late 20s, but she was sharp and thorough. She could run a total station with her eyes closed and had a better head for trigonometry than most engineers I'd worked with. We'd done a half dozen jobs together before this one, and I trusted her competence completely. The plan was straightforward. We'd drive in as far as the logging roads would take us, then pack in our equipment on foot to establish a series of control points over a 5-day period. We had a base camp location picked out near a reliable spring, and we'd work radially from there, setting monuments and taking measurements during the day, returning to camp each evening. We drove out from our office in Trout Lake on Monday, August 7th, 2023. The weather forecast was perfect. Clear skies, mild temperatures, low chance of precipitation. We had all our gear squared away, including 2 GPS units, a total station, measuring tapes, marking paint, steel survey stakes, a rock drill for setting permanent monuments, and enough food and water for a week even though we only planned 5 days. The logging road deteriorated faster than expected. By the time we reached the point where we planned to park, the road was barely passable even for my truck. We unloaded gear, sorted it into 2 backpacks and several loads we'd need to shuttle, and started hiking in around 10 in the morning. The forest here is second growth mixed with pockets of old growth that somehow survived logging in the 50s and 60s. Western hemlock, Douglas fir, and western red cedar dominate, with a thick understory of vine, maple, salal, and Oregon grape. The ground is spongy, with decades of needle drop and moss. It muffles sound in a way that can be disorienting if you're not used to it. We reached our planned base camp location around 1 in the afternoon. It was a flat area on a slight rise, maybe 50 yards from a small spring that burbled out of the rocks and formed a clear pool before disappearing into the soil downslope. The area showed signs of previous use: an old fire ring, some faded blazes on trees, a rusted tent stake half buried in the duff. "Someone's been here before," Sarah said, examining the fire ring. "Probably hunters," I said, "or the Forest Service doing exactly what we're doing. This is good terrain for baseline work." We set up camp efficiently. 2 tents, a cooking area away from the tents, food hung in a bear bag, even though black bears aren't usually aggressive in this area. I've learned that taking precautions is easier than dealing with consequences. We spent the rest of the afternoon doing reconnaissance, walking the area we'd be surveying, identifying good sight lines, and discussing where to place our first set of control points. That evening, we cooked a hot meal on my camp stove, reviewed the next day's plan, and went to bed early. The sun set behind the ridge around 8:30, and full darkness came quickly under the canopy. I remember lying in my tent thinking how quiet it was. No traffic noise, no aircraft, no human sounds at all. Just the faint trickle of the spring and the occasional rustle of wind in the high branches. I slept well that first night. No dreams, no disturbances. In the morning, we got up with the light, ate oatmeal and instant coffee, and started work. The first control point required us to hike about half a mile northeast to a rocky outcrop that had good visibility in multiple directions. We carried the total station, a tripod, the rock drill, and a 25-pound steel survey stake that we drill into solid rock to create a permanent monument. The work was standard. Set up the instrument, take measurements, drill the hole, set the stake, mark it with paint, record everything in the field book and on the GPS. It took most of the morning because we were being thorough. By noon, we had one solid control point established and documented. We returned to camp for lunch and to drop off the heavy equipment. That's when we noticed something odd. The steel survey stake we'd left at camp, a spare that we'd set beside the equipment pile, was gone. Not knocked over, not rolled away. Gone. Did you move it? Sarah asked. No. Did you? She shook her head. We both looked around the immediate area. It wasn't a small object. It was a 3-foot-long piece of steel rebar, painted orange on one end, weighing about 25 pounds. You don't misplace something like that. We found it about 20 yards from camp, standing upright in soft soil, driven in about 6 inches, like someone had pounded it in with a sledgehammer. Except we hadn't brought a sledgehammer, and the stake had been lying horizontally when we left. And Sarah looked at me. That's weird. Yeah, I said. I walked around the stake, examining the ground. No footprints. No disturbance in the duff, except for the hole the stake was in. Maybe it rolled and somehow ended up like this. Even as I said it, I knew it was nonsense. Steel rebar doesn't roll uphill, and it doesn't drive itself into the ground. Sarah knew it too, but we did what people do when confronted with something that doesn't make sense. We explained it away and moved on. We pulled the stake out, brought it back to camp, and ate lunch. Then we headed out to establish the second control point, this one to the southeast. The afternoon was hot and still, and by the time we finished the second point and returned to camp, we were both tired and ready to eat and rest. At camp, we found another anomaly. One of our camera traps, the kind wildlife photographers use to capture animals on trail, had been moved. We'd set up 3 cameras around the perimeter of camp as a security measure, more out of curiosity than genuine concern. They were strapped to trees at about chest height, angled to cover approaches to camp. One of them, the one facing east, had been turned. The camera was still attached to the tree, but it was now facing straight up at the canopy instead of horizontally at the trail. The strap hadn't come loose. The camera had been physically rotated on the tree. Sarah checked the SD card. The camera had triggered 47 times between the time we left in the morning and when we returned. She scrolled through the images on the camera's small screen, and her face went pale. "Look at this," she said, handing me the camera. I scrolled through the images. Most of them showed nothing but forest, green and shadows, exactly what you'd expect. But scattered throughout were images that made my skin prickle. In about a dozen frames, there were 2 bright points of light visible in the background, too high off the ground to be a deer or coyote. They appeared to be eye shine, the reflection you get when a camera flash hits an animal's retinal tapetum. But the height was wrong. The points of light were at least 7 or 8 feet off the ground, and they appeared in different locations around our camp, always at the edge of the frame, always paired, always at that same unnatural height. "What animal's eyes are that high?" Sarah asked. I didn't have an answer. Elk can be tall, but elk don't move through dense forest the way these images suggested, and elk eye shine is typically yellowish or green. These were more reddish, almost amber. "Could be a glitch," I said. Moisture on the lens, light artifact. Sarah didn't look convinced, and neither was I. We checked the other two cameras. They'd captured nothing unusual, just normal forest scenes, couple shots of a gray squirrel, one image of a raven. That night, we built a small fire in the established fire ring. Neither of us said it, but we both wanted the light and the psychological comfort. We ate dinner, discussed the next day's work, and tried to ignore the growing feeling that something about this place was off. Around 9 at night, after we'd put out the fire and retreated to our tents, I heard something that made me fully alert. From somewhere in the forest, maybe 100 yards away, came a sharp crack. Wood on wood, like someone hitting a tree with a thick branch. I listened. About 30 seconds later, another crack from a different direction, then a third, farther out. The pattern continued for several minutes, always from different locations, always that same resonant impact sound. "You hearing this?" Sarah called from her tent. "Yeah, probably branches falling, all at the same time, in a pattern." I didn't have a response to that. The cracking continued, sporadically for maybe 20 minutes, then stopped. The silence that followed was profound. No insects, no wind, nothing. I lay awake for a long time, listening to that silence, and eventually fell into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, Tuesday, August 8th, we found footprints. They were in soft mud at the edge of the spring, clear and distinct. At first glance, I thought they were human prints, but the size made me pause. These were huge, easily 17 or 18 inches long, maybe 8 inches wide. The shape was generally humanoid, 5 toes, an arch, a heel, but the proportions were exaggerated, like someone had scaled up a normal footprint by a factor of 2. Sarah and I stood there looking at them, neither of us speaking. I pulled out my tape measure and documented the dimensions, and took photos with scale references. There were 3 prints in sequence, showing a normal walking gait, and they led from the forest toward the spring, then back into the forest on the other side. "Bear?" Sarah said, but her tone was uncertain. "No. Look at the toe arrangement. That's not a bear." "Then what is it?" I didn't answer because the honest answer was that I didn't know. And admitting that felt like opening a door I wanted to keep closed. We were professionals. We dealt with facts and measurements. Anomalous footprints didn't fit that framework. We spent that day establishing 2 more control points, working with a focus that was partly professional and partly a need to stay busy and not think about the prints. By the time we returned to camp in the evening, we were both exhausted. As we prepared dinner, Sarah checked the camera traps again. The one that had been turned now showed it had been triggered another 38 times during the day. She scrolled through the images and stopped at one that made her inhale sharply. "Look at this." The image showed our camp from the perspective of the eastern camera in the foreground. You could see the corner of my tent and part of our equipment pile. But in the background, partially obscured by a tree, there was a shape. It was tall and dark, upright, with what looked like broad shoulders. The image was slightly blurred, like whatever it was had been moving, but the form was distinct enough to be unsettling. "That could be a shadow," I said. "Or a stump. Stumps don't move between frames," Sarah said. She showed me the sequence. In the frame before, the shape wasn't there. In the frame after, it had moved positioned slightly deeper into the trees. We checked the timestamps. The images had been captured around 11 in the morning while we were out working on the survey. "Something was in our camp today while we were gone," Sarah said quietly. "Something big enough to trigger the camera at that distance. And it was standing upright." I wanted to dismiss it, but I couldn't. The evidence was accumulating. The moved survey stake, the camera repositioned, the eye shine at impossible heights, the massive footprints, the wood knocking, and now a shape in our camp that looked disturbingly like a very large person. That night, I didn't sleep well. I lay in my tent listening to every sound, trying to separate normal forest noise from potential threats. Around midnight, I heard something that made my heart rate spike. Footsteps, not four-legged, not the light steps of a deer or the shuffling gait of a bear. These were heavy, deliberate, bipedal steps moving around the perimeter of our camp. I could hear each footfall distinctly, the crunch of organic matter, the snap of small twigs, the displacement of the forest floor under significant weight. The steps were slow and measured, like whatever was making them was being careful not to trip in the darkness. I reached for my headlamp but didn't turn it on. Some instinct told me that revealing my awareness might provoke a response I didn't want. I just lay there, tracking the movement by sound. The steps circled the camp once, maybe at a distance of 30 or 40 yards, always staying just outside where our tents were positioned. Then they moved closer. I could hear them approaching my tent specifically, each step sounding heavier and more deliberate. They stopped maybe 10 feet from my tent. I held my breath. I could hear something breathing, deep and controlled, the kind of breath a large mammal makes after exertion. The breathing continued for maybe 30 seconds, then stopped, and then I felt it. The tent fabric pressed inward, pushed by something from outside. Not violently, not tearing or clawing, just a gentle, sustained pressure, like a large hand or paw pressing against the nylon from the outside. The pressure moved slowly across the side of the tent, starting near the door and moving toward the back. I could see the fabric deform inward, could hear the slight creak of the tent poles adjusting to the stress. My entire body was rigid, my hand gripping my knife, though I knew a knife would be useless against whatever was out there. The pressure released, and the footsteps moved away, circling around to Sarah's tent. I heard her make a small sound, half gasp, half whimper. The steps paused at her tent, then continued their circuit, moving back into the forest. After several minutes of silence, Sarah whispered, "Are you awake?" "Yeah." "Did something just touch your tent?" "Yeah." "What was it?" "I don't know, but we're leaving in the morning." There was a long pause, and Sarah said, "Good." We didn't sleep the rest of that night. We just lay there in the darkness, listening, waiting for dawn. When the sky finally started to lighten, I felt a wave of relief so strong it made me nauseous. We packed up camp as quickly as possible, barely speaking, just moving with purpose. We left most of the survey equipment we'd set up, decided we'd come back for it later with more people or not at all. All that mattered was getting out. As we were doing our final check of the camp area, Sarah found something that made us both stop cold. Sitting on top of the equipment pile, arranged neatly, were 3 pine cones. They'd been placed in a triangle formation, each one oriented with the stem pointing toward the center. "We didn't do that," Sarah said. "No, we didn't." The pine cones were fresh, still slightly damp with sap. They'd been placed there recently, probably during the night while we were in our tents being circled by whatever was out there. We left them where they were and started hiking out. The walk back to the truck felt longer than it should have, and the entire time I had the overwhelming sensation of being watched. Not the passive observation of wildlife, but active attention, the feeling of intelligence focused on you. We reached the truck around 10 in the morning. Everything was exactly as we'd left it, no damage, no disturbance. We threw our packs in the bed and got in, locking the doors immediately. As I started the engine, Sarah pointed toward the tree line. "Look." About 50 yards back, standing just inside the forest, was a figure in the morning light. I could see it clearly. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark reddish-brown hair. It stood upright, arms at its sides, watching us with what looked like calm interest. The proportions were wrong for any animal I knew. Too tall, too broad in the shoulders, arms too long. We stared at each other across the distance. It made no move toward us, no aggressive posture. It just stood there, and after a moment, it turned and walked into the forest. Not running, not hiding, just walking away with a casual gait that suggested it had satisfied its curiosity. I put the truck in gear and drove out slowly, Checking the rearview mirror constantly, the figure didn't reappear. We drove straight to the Forest Service office in Trout Lake. The woman at the desk listened to our report with an expression that started neutral and gradually shifted to something like recognition. "You work in the baseline survey near Adams Fork?" she asked. "Yeah, or we were. We're not going back." She nodded slowly. "We've had reports from that area before. Mostly trail crew and fire lookouts. Things moved at camp. Structures made of branches. Footprints that don't match any known wildlife. Vocalizations at night." "Why didn't anyone tell us this before we went out there?" Sarah asked, and her voice had an edge to it. The woman looked uncomfortable. "Because officially, we have no confirmed evidence of anything unusual. Just anecdotal reports that could be explained by bears, elk, human visitors, natural phenomena. We can't issue warnings based on unverified claims." "Those weren't unverified," I said. "We have photos, we have measurements, we have direct observations." "Then you'll need to file a formal incident report," she said. "We'll document it and add it to the file for that area." We filled out the paperwork, provided copies of our photos, and described everything we'd experienced. The woman thanked us and said she'd forward the report to the appropriate people. As we were leaving, she said something that stuck with me. "For what it's worth, the pattern we've seen over the years suggests that whatever's out there is territorial, but not aggressive. It doesn't want you in that specific area, and it makes that clear through intimidation, but it doesn't follow people out. It doesn't pursue. It just encourages you to leave." Sarah and I drove back to our office in silence. We submitted our incomplete survey data to the client with an explanation that unforeseen circumstances had prevented completion of the full baseline. Our boss was frustrated but accepted it. Sarah quit the firm 2 weeks later and took a job doing survey work in urban areas exclusively. She told me she couldn't handle remote locations anymore, that every sound made her think something was watching. I still do survey work, including backcountry projects, but I have new protocols now. I check with local Forest Service offices about incident reports in the area before accepting remote jobs. I don't work alone if I can avoid it. I set up camera traps and review them daily. And if my equipment gets moved or rearranged overnight in ways that can't be explained by wind or animals, I pack up and leave immediately. This isn't a campfire story or entertainment. This is a documented experience that happened to two trained professionals who were doing legitimate scientific work in a remote area. We weren't looking for anything unusual. We weren't primed to see things that weren't there. We were focused on measurements and data, and what we encountered forced us to acknowledge that our understanding of what exists in these forests is incomplete. The Gifford Pinchot National Forest covers over 1.3 million acres of wilderness. Most of it is never visited by humans, not even by trail crews or fire lookouts. In that vast green expanse, there's room for things that prefer to remain undocumented. And some of those things are intelligent enough to know what a survey stake is, what a camera is, and how to make their presence known without ever being fully seen. When your survey equipment gets rearranged overnight in a pattern you didn't teach, the land is telling you something. Listen. Because the warning you get might be the gentle kind, the kind that involves moved stakes and pinecone arrangements. The alternative is finding out what happens when something decides you didn't take the hint. We were lucky. We listened. We left. And whatever was in those woods let us go. Not everyone might get that option. I photographed wolves, bears, and mountain lions in the wild. I know what it looks like when an animal watches you. This wasn't that. This was intelligence, and it was testing us. This happened in September of 2023 in the Marble Mountain Wilderness of Northern California. I'm a wildlife photographer by trade, and I'd spent the better part of a decade chasing shots of predators in their natural habitat. I know how to move quietly, how to read sign, and how to make myself invisible when something dangerous is nearby. I also know the difference between being observed by an animal following its instincts and being studied by something that's thinking about you. The Marble Mountains are remote even by California standards, The wilderness area covers over 240,000 acres of granite peaks, alpine meadows, and dense coniferous forest. The trails are maintained sporadically, and once you get more than 5 miles from a trailhead, you can go days without seeing another person. I'd picked a route that would take me deep into the backcountry, following Woolly Creek up to a series of small lakes where I'd heard mountain goats were still active despite the season. I followed my itinerary with the ranger station in Happy Camp on Thursday, September 14th, 2023. The ranger on duty was a woman in her 50s named Carol who'd worked that district for over 20 years. She looked at my route on the map and tapped the area near Marble Valley. "You planning to camp near the creek?" she asked. "That's the idea," I said. "Good water source, and the light's better in the mornings, near the drainage." She nodded slowly, like she was deciding whether to say something. Finally, she did. "We've had some reports this season. A couple of backpackers said they had issues with something getting into their food, even when it was hung properly. One guy said his tent got pushed in on while he was sleeping." "Bear?" I asked. "Maybe," she said, but her tone suggested she didn't think so. "Just be smart about it. Keep your bear spray handy, and if something doesn't feel right, trust that." I thanked her and left. At the time, I thought she was just doing the standard cautionary speech they give solo hikers. Looking back, I think she was trying to warn me without saying something that would sound crazy. The first day was exactly what I'd hoped for. I started hiking around 8 in the morning, under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. The trail climbed steadily through mixed pine and fir, the air sharp with resin and dry needles. I passed a few day hikers on their way out, exchanged nods, and by early afternoon I'd left all foot traffic behind. The only sounds were my boots on the trail, the occasional bird call, and the distant white noise of the creek below. I made camp around 4 in the afternoon in a flat area about 30 yards from Woolly Creek. The spot had a established fire ring, and the ground was clear of roots. I set up my tent, a lightweight two-person model that I used because it gave me room for my camera gear. I filtered water, hung my food bag on a proper bear line between two trees, a good distance from camp, and ate a cold dinner while the sun dropped behind the ridgeline. The light that evening was perfect, golden and angled, the kind that makes everything look like a painting. I took a few shots at the creek, the way the light caught the ripples, and then sat by the fire ring without lighting it. I wanted to preserve my night vision because I was hoping to get some shots of stars later. That's when I noticed the quiet. It wasn't the normal evening quiet where the daytime birds stop and the night shift hasn't started yet. It was a complete absence of sound. No insects, no rustling, no distant coyote. Just the creek, and even that seemed muted. I've spent enough nights outdoors to know that total silence usually means something big is nearby and everything else is hiding. I stood up and scanned the tree line. The shadows were getting long, but I could still see pretty well. Nothing moved. I told myself it was probably a bear or a mountain lion passing through, and that I'd done everything right with my food storage. Still, I pulled my bear spray out of my pack and kept it in my tent vestibule within arm's reach. I didn't sleep well that first night. Not because anything happened, but because my brain wouldn't let me relax. I kept listening for movement, for the sound of something approaching camp. Around midnight, I finally drifted off. I woke to the sound of rocks hitting my tent. Not pebbles, rocks. The kind that make a solid thunk when they hit nylon. I sat up fast, heart hammering, and listened. Another rock hit the side of the tent, then another. They were coming from different directions, landing in a loose pattern around me, not random, deliberate. I grabbed my headlamp and bear spray and unzipped the tent. The beam cut through the darkness, sweeping across trees and underbrush. Nothing. The rocks had stopped the moment I moved. I stood there in my boxer shorts and boots, breath coming fast, scanning for eye shine or movement. "Hey," I shouted. "If someone's out there, this isn't funny." My voice echoed slightly off the rocks across the creek. No response. No laughter. No footsteps running away like you'd expect from a prankster. I waited for a full 5 minutes, light sweeping, ears straining. Finally, I stepped out of the tent and walked the perimeter of my camp with the beam pointed down. That's when I found the rocks. 6 of them, river stones from the creek, placed in a nearly perfect circle around my tent. Each one was about the size of a baseball, smooth and wet like they'd just been pulled from the water. My stomach tightened. This wasn't random. This wasn't a bear. Bears don't throw rocks. They don't arrange them. I checked my food bag, still hanging, untouched. I checked my gear, everything where I'd left it. Whoever or whatever had done this had focused solely on surrounding my tent with creek stones while I slept. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I sat in my tent with the headlamp off, bear spray in one hand, knife in the other, listening. Around 3 in the morning, I heard footsteps, not four-legged, 2. Heavy, deliberate steps moving through the forest parallel to the creek. I could hear branches breaking, the crunch of needles and twigs, a rhythm that was distinctly bipedal. Step, step, pause. Step, step, pause. Like something walking carefully, testing each footfall. The steps moved in a wide arc around my camp, staying just beyond where my headlamp would reach if I turned it on. I didn't turn it on. Some instinct told me that revealing my awareness would provoke a response I didn't want. The circling continued for maybe 20 minutes. Then it stopped. Silence again. And then, from the direction of the creek, I heard a sound that made every hair on my body stand up. It was a low, guttural vocalization. Not a growl, not a roar. Something between a groan and a grunt, resonant and deep, like it was coming from a chest cavity much larger than a human's. It lasted about 5 seconds, then cut off abruptly. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I sat there until the sky started to lighten, until the birds finally started making noise again, until the normal morning sounds of the forest returned. When there was enough light to see, I got out of the tent and examined the area around my camp more carefully. That's when I found the print. It was in a patch of soft soil near the creek, about 15 yards from my tent. At first, I thought it was a bear print, but as I crouched next to it, the details resolved into something else entirely. It was a footprint, a human-shaped footprint, except it was massive. I pulled out my camera and set my lens cap next to it for scale. The print was at least 16 inches long and about 7 inches wide at the ball. 5 distinct toes, a clear arch, and a heel strike that had sunk deep into the mud. The depth suggested serious weight, more than any person I had ever met. What made my hand shake as I photographed it was the detail. This wasn't a vague impression. I could see dermal ridges in the soil, the texture of skin, the way the toes had gripped slightly as whatever made it pushed off. And the print was fresh. The edges were still sharp, the moisture content in the soil indicating it had been made within the last few hours. I took 24 photos from different angles, with different lighting, with scale references. Then I stood up and looked at the tree line. In the growing morning light, I could see broken branches at about 7 feet high leading away from the creek into denser forest. Something big had pushed through there, and recently, I should have left right then. That's what a smart person would have done. But I'm a photographer, and my brain was screaming that I might have evidence of something extraordinary. I decided to stay one more night, set up my camera traps, see if I could document whatever had visited my camp. That decision almost killed me. I spent the day setting up 4 trail cameras in a loose perimeter around my camp, each one mounted at chest height on trees, angled to cover approaches from different directions. I used cameras with no glow infrared so they wouldn't spook whatever was out there. I also reinforced my food hang, checked and rechecked my bear spray, and built a proper fire ring with rocks from the creek. As the sun started to set on Friday, September 15th, 2023, I felt the same oppressive quiet settle over the forest. The temperature dropped faster than it should have, and a smell drifted in on the wind. It's hard to describe, but it was organic and wrong. Wet dog mixed with rotting meat and something else, something musky and pungent that made my sinuses burn. I lit my fire early, wanting the light and the psychological comfort. I ate dinner quickly, then sat with my back against a log, facing the forest, bear spray on my lap. The fire popped and crackled, sending sparks up into the darkening sky. Around 8:30, the wood knocking started. It came from across the creek, a sharp crack like someone hitting a tree with a heavy stick. Thwack, pause, thwack, thwack, pause. It was rhythmic, deliberate, and it was answered almost immediately by another series of knocks from my left, deeper in the forest. I've heard trees fall. I've heard branches break in the wind. This wasn't that. This was communication. The knocking continued for several minutes, moving around me in a pattern I couldn't quite track, sometimes close, sometimes distant, always that same deliberate rhythm. Then it stopped, and I heard the footsteps again. This time they were closer. I could hear the weight of each step, the way the ground seemed to compress under something heavy. The steps moved along the creek bank, stopping every few seconds like whatever was making them was pausing to look toward my fire. I stood up slowly and added more wood to the fire, making it brighter. The flames leapt up, and in that moment of increased light, I saw it. Across the creek, maybe 40 yards out, standing between two large pines, was a figure. It was massive, easily 7.5 feet tall, with shoulders that seemed too broad to be human. It was covered in dark hair, reddish brown in the firelight, and it was standing completely still, facing me. I froze, every muscle in my body locked up. We stared at each other across the distance, across the fire, across the creek. I could see the shape of its head, the way its arms hung too long at its sides, the bulk of its chest, but I couldn't see its face clearly. The shadows and distance obscured the details. Then it moved, not toward me. It took 2 steps to the right, smooth and controlled, and vanished behind a tree. When it didn't reappear, I realized it had simply left. No rush, no sound of retreat. It had looked at me, decided something, and walked away. I stood there shaking for a solid 5 minutes before my legs would work again. When I could move, I grabbed my headlamp and swept the area where I'd seen it. Nothing, just trees and darkness. I didn't sleep at all that night. I kept the fire going until I ran out of wood, then sat in my tent with every light I had pointed outward. The smell came and went in waves, sometimes so strong it made me gag. I heard the footsteps circle my camp 3 more times, always staying just out of sight. And around 3 in the morning, I heard something that still gives me chills. From the darkness beyond my tent, a voice spoke. It wasn't words exactly. It was a sound that mimicked human speech, a modulated vocalization that rose and fell like someone talking, but without any meaning I could grasp. It sounded curious, almost questioning, like something trying to communicate in a way it had observed but didn't fully understand. I didn't respond. I didn't move. I just sat there until dawn. When the sun finally came up on Saturday, September 16th, 2023, I packed my gear with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. I pulled the SD cards from all 4 cameras, collapsed my tent, stuffed everything into my pack without caring about organization. I just wanted out. As I was doing a final sweep of camp, I found something that made me stop cold. Sitting on top of the rock I'd use as a seat by the fire was a twisted piece of wood, not a stick. A piece of carefully bent green wood, twisted into a loose spiral, with the bark partially stripped off. It hadn't been there when I went to bed. It was placed deliberately, like a calling card. I left it there, I shouldered my pack and started hiking out at a pace just short of running. The trail back felt longer than it should have, and every shadow made me jump. But I kept moving, kept putting distance between me and that camp. I reached the trailhead around 2 in the afternoon. My truck was the only vehicle there, exactly where I'd left it. I threw my pack in the bed and got in, locking the doors immediately. As I started the engine, I looked back at the trailhead. Standing at the tree line, maybe 50 yards back, was the figure. In full daylight, I could see it clearly. Reddish-brown hair covering its entire body, a face that was too flat and too forward to be entirely ape-like, eyes that caught the light and reflected it back. It stood there watching me, arms at its sides, making no move toward the parking area. I put the truck in reverse and backed out slowly, keeping my eyes on it. It didn't move. It just watched. When I turned the truck around and started down the forest road, I looked in my rearview mirror one last time. It was still there, standing at the exact edge where forest met clearing, like there was an invisible line it wouldn't cross. I drove straight to the ranger station. Carol was there, and when she saw my face, she stood up immediately. "What happened?" she asked. I told her everything. The rocks, the footsteps, the print, the figure. She listened without interrupting, her expression neutral. When I finished, she nodded slowly. "You get any photos?" she asked. I pulled out my camera and showed her the print. She studied it for a long moment, then looked up at me. "I'm going to file this as a wildlife incident report. That's the official channel for this kind of thing. Do you believe me?" I asked. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "3 weeks ago, a trail crew reported finding a tree structure up near Marble Valley. Saplings bent into a teepee formation, too deliberate to be wind damage. 2 months before that, a backpacker reported seeing something large and bipedal crossing a meadow at dawn. Before that, we had 2 separate incidents of camps being circled at night by something that walked on 2 legs." She paused. "So yes, I believe you." She took my information, copied the photos from my camera to her computer, and filed the report. She also told me something I'll never forget. "If you go back," she said, "and I'm not saying you should, but if you do, remember that it had multiple chances to hurt you and didn't. It threw rocks around you, not at you. It circled your camp, but it didn't enter it. Whatever it is, it seems to have rules, boundaries it respects." I thanked her and left. I haven't been back to the Marble Mountains. I did check the trail cameras when I got home, and 3 of them had captured something. They showed a large, hair-covered figure moving on 2 legs through the frame, always at the edge of the camera's range, always partially obscured by trees. The 4th camera, the one closest to my tent, had been moved, not knocked down, carefully lifted and turned to face a tree, like something had deliberately repositioned it. I've thought about that a lot. The intelligence required to understand what a camera is and how to neutralize it. The restraint required to circle a camp repeatedly without attacking. The curiosity demonstrated by the thrown rocks and the twisted wood left as a marker. I still photograph wildlife. I still go into the backcountry. But I have new rules now. If I find large bipedal tracks, I don't camp nearby. If something starts throwing rocks around my tent in a pattern, I leave immediately. And if I smell that combination of wet dog and rotting meat on the wind, I pack up and move to a new location. This isn't a ghost story or a campfire tale. This is a field report from someone who spent 15 years learning how predators behave, only to discover that the biggest predator in the North American wilderness isn't interested in eating you. It's interested in understanding you. And that's somehow more unsettling. If you're planning a trip into remote wilderness areas, especially in the Pacific Northwest or Northern California, take this seriously. Keep your camp clean. Keep your food secured. And if rocks start landing in a perfect circle around your tent, don't wait for morning. Pack your gear and get to your vehicle while you still can. Some things out there are willing to let you leave, but they'll only offer once.